Hey everyone, welcome back to the DGA YouTube channel. In a previous video, I was talking to you about the problems of centralized games. And that video was a lead-in for this video, where I'm going to be talking to you about why do you want to build decentralized games. And part of the motivation for building a decentralized game is the fact that we should try to overcome the problems of centralized games. And that's something I'm going to be exploring in this video. Not only pointing out the why, but I'm going to be telling you about the actual tangible benefits to the user and why I think it's important to move paradigm from the centralized gaming one that we have now to a whole new paradigm of fully decentralized gaming. Let me go through the slides and I think everything will start to be much clearer. In a previous video, I talked about what a decentralized game is. So that was a video within this series of videos about trying to explain decentralized gaming. So here is this list again that I had it in the previous video, and these are like the main points as to what it is that we're looking for a decentralized game. So there should be distributed consensus. It should be fault tolerant. There should be a blockchain in there for record keeping and basically data availability. Ideally, it should be open source, and we accept that NFTs are a useful software component, and there is something to them that's beyond just collectibles. Even if collectibles are a big part of online games, they're not the only part, and it's something we should keep in mind. Also, in a previous video, I talked about what is a decentralized game, so like from a definition point of view, and here's a very quick definition, shall we say, which is a game that has distributed planning and authority and therefore designed to resist single points of failure. Of course, we are only interested in computer games, and of course specifically ones that use blockchain technology. You can have a wider definition, but this is what we really wanted to work with. That's what we're interested in. Now, why? And this is obviously something that I mentioned in previous videos. I mentioned that there are good reasons as to why we might want to do something in this kind of rather difficult way. There's a lot of challenges to building a decentralized game, so it might sound a little bit crazy as to why would you want to do that? Why would you bother? Why would you want to put an entire game onto a blockchain? Well, you don't quite put the entire game onto the blockchain. That's the thing. So in this video, I'm going to go through basically each of these points and point out the features, shall we say, like true ownership, and then I will say what the benefit is to the player. And I think this is the key takeaway from this presentation, or the key takeaways from this presentation are the actual benefits to the players, and it's not just the fact that we have cool technology. So I'm going to talk through true ownership, that cheating is impossible, that we have transparent economics, that we can have a high market value for the entire ecosystem of the game, potentially higher than an old traditional centralized game. The games can also be persistent and unstoppable. And the last one here, looking over my microphone, is about governance and player influence. So let's take each of these in turn. True ownership is about owning your items and them being truly your items and not someone else's. With traditional MMOs, the items and your account are basically owned by the developers. And I think that's problematic. It basically means that if you were to leave the game, then all of your time and your effort is locked into the game. And that's a bit frustrating. And it's generally, these are locked by the agreements that you essentially sign whenever you start playing a game. Moreover, I don't think it's right for developers to just take your items, to either ban them or blacklist them or remove them from the game. Because that would also mean that they are not truly your items, because the developers can, at whim, take them away from you. And of course, this means that there are challenges whenever you create your game, but it's a challenge that should be solved rather than ignored. Of course, there will be times, as I've mentioned here on the slide, there will be some instances in the game where stealing is part of the game mechanics, and that is obviously different from just a developer taking your items. Or maybe there's an exploit in the code that a player can just take your items. So we're not talking about the part or the aspect of gameplay where your items can be stolen as part of gameplay. We're talking about where it's not part of gameplay. What are the benefits? I hope the benefits are obvious. The fact is that players can trade their items when they want, and they don't need to seek permission from a developer or anyone else to trade their items. Moreover, they can trade these items for real value. That's kind of part of the play to earn paradigm, shall we say. Of course, as kind of mentioned, your items are not locked. Your account is not locked. You can sell the items, as I said, so there's no loss of effort. So if you spend hours and hours or days and days mining, gathering resources and then crafting it, then you can sell that and basically be paid in real money for your effort. And for me, that's a real benefit because it means that it's not exactly wasted time. Yes, games can be fun, but sometimes you're playing an MMO and some aspects of an MMO are not necessarily fun. The outcome can be fun, but sometimes the journey to get to the outcome is less fun. And as I'm kind of saying in a lot of my slides, asset values can be higher because there's better trust instilled within the game and the fact that trade is liberated. This will be a common theme. Let me move on to the next slide. So I stated that cheating is impossible, and part of the reason that cheating is impossible, as I hope I alluded to in previous videos, is that all of your actions, all player actions, are signed, so cryptographically signed, so it's all provable where they came from. They're broadcasted to every single node, so therefore to every single player, and they're going to be stored on chain for all time, which means that there's always a record of who did what, and it's all verifiable of who did what. The game logic itself does not need to be on chain. That's one thing I just point out as a caveat, but it can still be decentralized and off chain. There is some confusion or misunderstanding as to what off-chain means. Off-chain does not necessarily mean on a developer server. Off-chain can be done on a player's computer, so it's not on the chain, but then you still have to have some sort of proof or some sort of record of the actions, and of course you need some way to eventually verify those actions. That gets into more detail than I want. That is getting us into the architecture, which is going to be in a later video. Because there are nodes that agree upon this history of actions, then there's a consensus. So this is the distributed consensus that I mentioned earlier. And by verifying actions, the third point here is you're basically saying, okay, if a player's speed is 10 squares per turn, then they can't run faster than that. They can't run at 15 squares per turn, because obviously that would be outside of the rules of what is permitted. And every player within the network will see that someone is trying to cheat, and therefore they can ignore that action. And that's really the power of making cheating impossible. There's a lot more that can be said. I think that's going to be a whole video in itself, or it could be a whole video in itself. So the benefits here is that you have provably fair gameplay, and that means, in my view, is that you have much less frustration. No one can have extra rewards or have extra super abilities that they shouldn't have. There's like a level playing field. So it's down to the players and how good the players are. And with many MMOs, it's not always about the actual Twitch skill that someone has, but rather you're playing a role, and it's much more level in that sense, because it is a game at the end of the day, or you can build a game in such a way. And I think removing this ability for someone to have like super special powers that they shouldn't have means that there's less frustration. Everyone's treated it in the same sort of fair way. Related to this is about fair item acquisition. Also, what I didn't mention here that I should have done was the fact that there's no item duplication. If you imagine, for example, that every item was an NFT and you could prove the origin of every item, that they were all made in the correct way. You can verify the history of actions. Then you know that each item is a genuine, real item, that it hasn't been duplicated. And that is also a statement about, the impossibility of cheating. Because of this, it means that there's going to be, I think, basically no fraud when it comes to trading. Maybe there's some caveat I need to think about, but let's just say that there's no fraud, and therefore you're going to have no rollbacks, or potentially, if it's less fraud, then it's less rollbacks. So let's go with that safer statement. Now, again, I'm going to be mentioning asset values, because I think it means that your player wealth is better protected because there's no cheating. There's no cheating, therefore there's no duplication, and therefore you have a known supply of items. You can't magically just mint 10,000 extra copies of the most valuable item in the game. It's impossible, because cheating is impossible. That means that you have a good level of trust in a rare item always being a rare item, and therefore this means that players have greater certainty in the wealth of their assets. Not necessarily the price, because you don't know whether the price is up or down, but there's going to be, I think, a trend into greater wealth for those who hold rare assets, basically. So that's mostly what I wanted to say about this. Transparent economics. Transparent economics is something else which is kind of given by default of having a blockchain. Everything is essentially open, it's recorded on chain, and this gives the ability for all players to monitor what's happening. And I think this gives greater trust in the game. There's going to be no stealth creation of money or items by the developers. They can't just sneak something in the back door. There can't be any players duplicating items or duplicating gold. If somehow some problem arose like that, let's just say that there was some exploit and somehow it worked out that there was some duplication or of duplication either of items or of gold, then of course players can be looking at the block explorer to see what's going on and do a little bit of digging and find out, what has happened. And I think the fact that players can do that, they can get a better idea of what's happening in, their economy for their game. One challenge on the back of this is, how do you keep player balances private, or how do you keep their bank account private and the items that they hold in their inventory? I think that's a hard one, and I think we might see something with ZK snarks. I don't want to promise anything here, because I think it is a tough problem to solve, and it's easy just to say, zero knowledge something and it will get fixed. And maybe that's what will happen in the future. Another way to look at it, a different perspective, is to say, what if that's actually a feature rather than a bug? Obviously, that's strange, because normally when I play a game, I don't like to broadcast how much gold I have in my account or how many items I have in my account. But, with this new paradigm of gaming, maybe it requires a different perspective. So what are the benefits here? Well, I think there's going to be greater loyalty, because you're kind of encouraging players to be monitoring the economy and to be actively watching the economy. It's basically their economy. And therefore, you're giving them the tools like a block explorer to look into the data, to pull the data out, to analyze it, to explore it. And that kind of sensation of them being in the economy and part of the economy and able to understand it, I think will instill a feeling of greater loyalty among your player base. I think so. I basically said that kind of the loyalty part is also part of improved trust, as I've hinted at in previous slides. And I think that also means that you've got happier players because there's better trust and that there's better loyalty. It all goes together. And again, a little bit like a broken record player, I'm talking about higher asset values. And it's many factors coming together to give greater loyalty, to give, greater trust. And therefore, the fact that you can trust this game with thousands of dollars that no one can steal, because of the higher level of trust. Now, if you had a low level of trust, you wouldn't maybe even want to put in $10, you might be afraid to put in $10. But if there's a high degree of trust, you can put in, say, $1,000 and be much more secure that it's not going to be stolen or somehow just disappear. And that's kind of the point that I've been trying to get at with this higher asset value. We see something like this with Bitcoin, where the Bitcoin can have a single transaction of $1 billion. I think this proves the level of trust that you can have in blockchain technology. And it's something that I really wouldn't see in a traditional game. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't necessarily think, we might not see a single sword of $1 billion either, but maybe you could have $1 billion worth of transactions total value within a single block. And that would be interesting too. It shows that there must be a high asset value for your ecosystem whenever that's true. One which is quite strange, I think, for many people is this idea of persistent and unstoppable, that the fact that a game can live forever. So it's kind of like its own archive, essentially. Of course, this doesn't mean the game will always be populated, but the fact that the game will always be around, you can always log back in and check it out. This is the idea where if a game is fully decentralized, you will have the game assets, you will have the game data from all players, and you are essentially like one of the servers, for lack of a better word. That is, you are a server that helps to run the game. So you are a fundamental part of the game network. And that's why it can be unstoppable and always available to access, because of the way that the data is stored and the way that data is shared across every single player. So what are the benefits to this? I think this is the one I probably struggled with to think of the immediate benefits. And I think it's the main one is that you don't lose your account. Your account is always there because the data is always there. And the fact that your account is always there is a better experience because it means you can always come back to it. Of course, so with many MMOs, I think people know, if you're an MMO player, you know that the game can go offline, games can be shut down and then eventually disappear, and all of the data that goes with that game that shuts down is eventually lost. And even if you never sell your items, that's a lot of time and effort that just disappears because the game has shut down. And that's annoying. That's a bad user experience. And here, I think if it's around forever, you can sort of just give some guarantee to a level of user experience that's just higher than what you get with a centralized game. Last point here is, yes, even though you can access the data forever, if you lose your password or your private key, then it almost doesn't matter that the data persists forever, because you would have a difficulty getting back into your account. Now, of course, this is a problem with blockchain technology in general, so we need to have some sort of solution. One potential solution that I know in the Polkadot ecosystem, when you use the Substrate framework, there is a module for social recovery, and you have a way to basically rely upon some friends to sort of prove that you were the owner of your account. It's something that you can set up. It's a bit like a multi-sig. That takes me a little bit away from what I wanted to talk about, but I wanted to just say that anyway. Another major factor, at least for me, this is a big one, is that the spirit of blockchain is about building open source technology. And that should be true for decentralized gaming too. All of the technology, both the code and the assets for the games, all of the art and everything, all the sound or whatever, all of that should be on an open source license and freely available to all players. And so I'm kind of saying that this is good for forking the code, etc., which is going to be something I'll mention in just a second. I think there's an implied network effect there that we do see with blockchain technology, because the fact that it is open source. The benefits, as I've been alluding to, is that you encourage better player participation because people can see the code and therefore they can comment on the code, or they can criticize it, or they can suggest improvements. They can make pull requests to your GitHub repo, And therefore this is better loyalty for one, because they feel like they are part of the development of the game. And very related to that point is governance, that there's better player governance because they are able to see the code and be involved and look at it and touch it and make the updates themselves, which just isn't possible with centralized games. If they were open source centralized games, then yeah, okay, that maybe that is possible. I should also, in my previous video I mentioned the old school RuneScape has a nice governance system where they do take player opinions and feedback very seriously, but it's rather the exception almost to the rule. So I think players will gravitate towards games where their opinions can have some sort of weight, and this is the network effect that I'm talking about. People gather to, say, Ethereum or Bitcoin in part because it is open source, in part because they can have a voice in pushing the ecosystems forward. Of course, the asset values being high and asset values climbing, of course, is always a big catch for people to come to the blockchain space. That kind of is what it is. Last point here. I've mentioned a little bit already about forking the code base. What I could also say here as a benefit of forking is that you can fork a game. You can run some sort of a testnet or an alternative version of the game with alternative rules. So you can try out an alternative rule set. You can still have real asset values as a real live network. And if those ideas are good and the testing goes well, those ideas can then be merged back into the main game. And that lets you test some ideas with real economic actors, and you can do it in a fairly low risk environment to see what happens before you implement it to your major game instance where there's lots of players and where there's lots of things can go wrong. So that should decrease the risk in testing out new experimental ideas, not just little tweaks to the game, but maybe let's say you have like a huge parameter change coming up. You can test that out in a live environment and then bring it back. Now, of course, you could do a test net, like just a pure test net where nothing has value, but in some ways it is nice to test things out with a real economic value where the token actually has some sort of monetary value. And it's a little bit like Kusama and Polkadot. Both are the same code base, and both have tokens that have some real value in the real world. So there is a different meaning there than there is with a pure testnet. And that looks like it was everything I wanted to say. I'm going to put all of the links into the description as always. I should have mentioned that we have a Discord. You've probably seen me mention that in the previous videos. We have obviously this YouTube channel. We have a book that I'm working on, which is open source. We have Twitter, so you can follow us there. And because the links will be in the description, I got to remember to put them there, then you'll be able to find us and you can come and join the conversation. It would be great if you could like the video and if you could subscribe to us, because that will help us with the algorithm and help us to share our message to a wider audience. So hopefully that gave you some idea of why we should build decentralized games and what are the real sort of benefits to the actual players themselves, of which I think there are many, and they are sort of, fairly high impact benefits to actually having a decentralized game. If you haven't seen the previous video about the problems with centralized games, I would suggest you watch that as well, and then compare that with what I've said here. So thank you very much, and I see you in the next video.